let me introduce myself a little bit, not to say, or give you a little bit of background, not to say, look at me, all the things I've done, but more just so you kind of have a little bit of an idea. And I'm sure that there's people in this room that probably have a lot more depth of knowledge than I do. But I come from very heavy Microsoft background. I started with classic ASP, if that tells you anything. So I came in there and kind of grew up through .NET, coming in through the .NET framework, and a lot of just web stuff. But I've done some Windows stuff as well, which will actually tie into the talk as we go. Because one thing that I've found as I go through development, I realize the more new things come out, the more we're solving the same problems over and over again, just in different ways. And that's really what RxJS to me kind of is all about. That as I've gotten to know it more and more, and that's kind of what I want to talk about, is why, how is this new? But again, at the same time, how is it the same? And what types of things have we learned in the past that we can use as we move forward into RxJS and our Angular apps? So, quick question for you guys: who here considers themselves new or maybe kind of a novice to Angular? Anybody? Okay, great. What about JavaScript? New to JavaScript? You've been using JavaScript? So for those of you that are new, kind of feel new, where are you coming from? Are you coming from jQuery, JavaScript, React? What's bringing you to Angular? Anyone? jQuery? Okay. Cool, we'll talk about that a bit, just how we move in. Anybody else? Other platforms? Okay, so what are your thoughts so far?
You can be brutally honest.
There's a lot of carryover between the two. It's a lot larger in its breadth, but also has a lot more ability to be precise and specific about what you're doing. So kind of a mixed bag, but I like it.
That's good. I feel kind of the same way. I'm actually working on a React project right now because it pays the bills, right? But I would say personal preference, I like Angular, but the reality is I like it because I've used it more. That's kind of where I've been in things. And the more that I learn about React, the more I see it, the more I realize they're doing almost exactly the same thing, just in slightly different ways. So if you're coming from React, hopefully you'll find that as well. So you'll be able to learn some of those things. All right, let's just get moving. For this demo, I don't have a whole lot of slides, which is fine. I spent most of my time yesterday trying to make sure I had a working demo today. So I don't have as many slides. I figured that was probably the better place to go. But I've got everything on GitHub, this demo with a PowerPoint and a database script as well. So yes, I am using SQL Server as a backend and a .NET Core for service to do that. So if you're not familiar with that, sorry about that, but that's where it is. That's what's on GitHub right now. But I am using a little bit of a database. So let me show you. Just briefly what we're going to be. Actually, yeah, let's go into the database. Sorry. Okay, that's where I want to be. I've just created basically a store database that's with books, but I wanted to keep it really simple just for this, and so I'm really just going to focus on this orders table. I had a categories table as well, but just to keep it simple, I'm just going to be dealing with the orders table. So, but for this database in the GitHub repo, I've actually got. In my database, I've got an install script that will create the database and populate it with all the sample data as well. So you can run that to that as well. So if you looked at the kind of the little blurb about what my talk was going to be about, I noted that this was, we're talking about React and RxJS and observables. So promises, Async-Await, and observables, and how we do with HTTP gets and things like that and posts. The reality is observables go way beyond that, and RxJS goes way beyond that. That was just kind of our launching point for this, because as we talk about Async-Await and asynchronous programming, that's a lot of times the first place that we start is we need to make asynchronous calls to the back end. So I wanted to take a look at that and really very quickly look at 4 different approaches historically. What I found, at least, we probably want to go, that's too dark. Let me change this. Color scheme, there we go, thank you. It's always what you're looking for when you're that works, okay. All right, when you're up in front of people, you can never find what you're looking for, right? Okay, so just briefly look at where we've been with HTTP, well, with asynchronous programming and where we are and kind of where we want to go. So I've got 4 demos. Let me run this. I think it's running right now. But I'm going to do it once with Ajax. So as we come in here to Ajax, we're going to go to the backend server and populate the data from the server. We'll do it with promises. It's really exciting. It's the same exact thing. Do it with Async-Await. And then finally, we'll do it once with observables. And then after we talk about the observables, we'll go deeper into observables, and we'll use this as a cart just to kind of create a store just to populate our cart. So it's not going to be a full-fledged application, but I think we'll get the point across. The only reason I want to bring up Ajax is just to show you how painful it used to be to do this kind of stuff. So for those of you that are new to JavaScript that never had to do this, you have no idea how good you have it. Okay, so in our Ajax demo, I've got a component, and then I've got a service that corresponds to each of these. So in our component, I've just got a button click event. Oh, sorry, I've got it on previous and on next. There are click events, so I've added some paging into there. But really, when we get the books, all I'm going to do is I'm going to define the URL to go where that is, and we're using just a RESTful service. And I'm using paging within there. And then I'm going to my Ajax service to get the books. So in the Ajax service, we had to define our XML HTTP request. And if that didn't exist, then we would create an ActiveX object if you're using Internet Explorer. And then after that, we would define where what we're using, a get, post, what verb we're using, and the URL. And then finally, we would do the HTTP send. As it turns out, with this XML HTTP, it didn't really like updating very, very quickly because it was designed to work with jQuery, right? We would use jQuery. We would get the request. Once we get the response, we would then use jQuery to go find a point in our, like a div, and then we'd replace what's in the div with a thing. Angular and React are totally different from that. We just want to rebind the data. So I actually had to turn this into a promise, and that's what's happening here. So I just on the onload event, I'm returning a promise there with the JSON.parse, and then same thing with onError. But if we were to look at this, what we used to have to do is the OnReadyState Change. When we create the function, when we make this call, we would constantly keep getting postbacks telling us of updates. Anytime something changed with the HTTP request, we would get that. And it's only when the ready state was set to 4, love magic numbers, when it's set to 4, then we'd know, okay, it's done. And we had to check to make sure it was status of 200. Now promises and the HTML fetch and Axios and HTTPClient, they take care of all that for us. They wrap around that. So I think that's enough about the Ajax demo. Let's go to promises real quick. In the promises, same type of thing. In fact, the logic looks almost identical here, so I'm just going to go into the service. Promises service. And what we're doing with TypeScript, I'm returning a promise of type book, array of books, and I'm just calling the fetch and then on fill, and then so we're just checking to see if the response is okay. So it's a little bit better. Just once it returns, once you get the return, I'm getting the response. And if it's not okay, then I'm throwing an error. Otherwise, I'm returning the JSON. And it's a promise. So with the promise, what I'm doing on the client side is I'm returning the promise. So again, I can't get the array of books immediately. I'm returning the promise, so I still say .then, and I can set this .books equal to the array of books that I returned. Oh, that's the other thing that I did in the service is that's why I had a then inside of here. I didn't return the promise directly because I'm just returning basically an HTTP response, so I wanted to get the body out of that before I return that back. Okay, so that's where I'm returning response.json. So this is where I got excited about Async-Await. Actually, Async-Await was available to us in .NET before TypeScript and JavaScript, so it was pretty exciting when that came about. It's asynchronous programming. It basically made this whole process a little bit easier. Instead of wrapping it inside of a promise, returning the promise, and getting, excuse me, and then getting the data asynchronously, I'm able to. Here's my async service. So it's basically just putting some wrapper around the promise object for us. The function needs to be called async. I need to have async in front of it. Notice I'm still doing a fetch URL. In fact, this right here is identical to inside the promise, and I'm still returning a promise even. So all I'm doing is I'm changing the syntax on how I'm calling this HTTP request, so this fetch. I've made this async, and therefore what I can now do in my async demo in the controller is when I call this, first of all, the function that calls an async function, an asynchronous function, has to also have the async keyword attached to it. So this function getBooks is called an async function, and then because of that, I can then, where am I? Oh, this await this .service.getBooks. And so when I await this, notice it just returns the data directly. I don't have to wrap the promise around here. I don't have to call the then. Seems like a little thing, but if you're doing this a lot, it can clean up your code heftily. So you'll see a lot more cleaner code. And instead of creating a bunch of callbacks or fat arrow functions to embed your logic, you can just do it right in line, and it will just wait. It'll just await and return the data for you. And then I can just throw it right inside of a try-catch. So if the promise throws an error, I can just use the regular try-catch syntax to do that. OK, so that brings us through Async-Await. So let's take a look at Angular, because Angular, as we know, is oh my gosh, my mind just went blank. Opinionated, yes. I'm opinionated too, but I can't remember how to say it, apparently. So it's very opinionated. So when we do our HTTP client, notice I've been using the HTML, just the JavaScript fetch keywords, just doing the fetch directly where I could have control of that. Of course, Angular has a library, the HTTP client library, but it doesn't return promises. It returns observables. So if you're new to Angular and you're new to observables, the first time you look at making HTTP request, you're probably going to get frustrated with this because it's a bit different. It feels like, oh my gosh, I'm having to do all this extra stuff just to get this data back from this call that I'm making. Let's take a look at that. I mean, ultimately, it's not, once you understand it, it's not that big of a deal, but it's extra work if all you want to do is make a single call. So let's look at this observable service. And in the observable service, well, number one, it returns instead of an HTTP promise, it returns an observable of books. Well, I said it was going to be longer, but look, it's a lot shorter. This.http get, I'm returning a type of books because it's generic, so I can specify the data type that's going to be returned, and I just pass in the URL. Pretty simple, since it's just a get method. Yeah, please.
What's the one sentence difference between promises and observables?
Observables are better. No. The one sentence difference. Basically, it's all about, if I'm going to narrow it down to one word, it's thinking reactively. That's the way observables are going to be, and we'll get deeper into that. I mean, that's a pretty vague, pretty broad statement to do that, but it's a mindset of thinking reactively on how you get your data, rather than with promises and Async-Await. You're thinking event-driven programming. I'm responding to when I do something, I want to make sure I'm in control of sending it and getting the data back. Whereas being reactive, which is the direction that Angular is really pushing us, is that we're just listening for events to happen, and we respond to the events that we're interested in. So, yeah. I saw another hand, or okay. So in that case, because of that, when I return this observable, I can't just pull out the data like I did in the promise. So let's go into my observables demo controller here, and I have to set things up just a little bit. And that is when I call get books. I create my URL. I'm going to create this.service get books, and here's the key. Instead of saying I want to get that return data, I'm now subscribing to that observable. So there's an object out there, and we'll take a look at that. It's a subject basically that I'm interested in. So I'm going to subscribe to any events that happen to that subject, and when that change happens, that's when I'm going to respond to here. So I'm subscribing to that, and here is what's going to happen.
So one thing that's been really helpful for me as I've been digging more into observables has been thinking of them and remembering these are just event streams. So if you've ever dealt with a stream of events, it just starts at A and goes until the stream is over, and that's what the complete means. And so when you think about it, the word observable is a little bit of a misnomer. It's just a stream of events. Now that stream might, as with an HTTP call, only have one event in it. But it's still just a stream of events, and you treat them all kind of that same way.
Right. No, absolutely, and that's exactly where I was going to go, is with the stream. No, I'm glad I'll give you the 20 after. So you led us right into that that topic. So the idea is that instead of just saying I want this one event, I'm going to fire it once, and once it's done, I'm done. I'm observing the stream, and then so I subscribe to the stream, and then I can unsubscribe as well. So with that subscription, as many times as things happen within that stream, as many times that event fires, I'll be able to respond to it. So I can be notified of changes as they happen and see much more real time.
I was going to point out too, with HTTPClient, you have to subscribe, otherwise the event won't even fire.
That's right.
You can't even just test that this endpoint works. It's like you have to subscribe and get something.
Yeah, and the HTTPClient is, that's the thing. There are different types of streams that we can listen to, and the HTTPClient has a very specific stream that as was noted, it will, once it fires once, and then it unsubscribes you automatically. So it's really a one-time event that happens. So in that case, it's still similar to the promise with an HTTP promise, because we're only going to listen to it once. But that's not the point of observables, right? They go way beyond that. That's really because when we make a RESTful request, it's a one-time thing. And so that's why the HTTP client only gives us one event. If we want to start talking about WebSockets, now we've got different types of streams that we can deal with, and there we can get many updates, and that's much more interesting when we start talking about observables. Okay, so basically I subscribe to this event, and that subscription, when it then gets fired, it knows, okay, I can go and execute, I can make the call because somebody's actually listening for that to happen, as was noted. All right, so what I want to bring up here, rather than starting this whole PowerPoint again, let's just bring this up here. So this is an old pattern that's been around for a long time. The Gang of Four patterns have been around. 94, I think, is when they came out. And there is this pattern that was defined there. You may have heard of it, the observer pattern. And this observer pattern, the way this works is we've got a subject. That's our model, basically. The thing that, the piece of data that we're interested in watching. And then we've got observers. Those are the things that are interested in that. So we may have different views. I mean, think about PowerPoint, for example. I've got one file that has all of my PowerPoint data, except for here, I've got this view that's kind of my large screen view. And then on the left, I've got this tile view. And the there's several other types of views that might work. So there's the slide sorter view, the outline view, right? So there's several different types of views. Every one of those views is an observer. They all want to look at the same data, but they're going to do something slightly different with it. That's where this observer pattern really shines, is because we've just got one source of truth, but people wanting to respond to it differently. Now, the top here, the subject and the observer, those are kind of our abstract classes or interfaces. That would be, and then we've got a concrete subject and a concrete observer that implement that. The way that this basically works, so if you notice here in this pattern, we've got our subject has the ability to attach an observer, detach an observer. So for instance, if I go to a different view, that view might be the observer, and it's going to say, hey, I'm interested in anytime there's a change, so I've attached that subject. And then secondly, or after that, I could detach. Like if I close out of that view, I don't want those notifications to keep going to a view that's not visible right then, so I may want to detach from that. And then lastly, I'm going to have this notify thing. So for example, if I come in here and I'm going to make a change in this repository, notice that this view automatically updated. That's because it was subscribed to the subject, and the subject notified that a change has been made. Now, it turns out that this pattern, as good as it is, there are some limitations with it. One of the problems is, well, first of all, one of the reasons that we have that we like this is because I don't want this view to be aware of any of the other views, for example. I don't want, making a change here, I don't want the view to have to say, go and update all the different views. It shouldn't care who's all in there. So we want that one source of truth, and we want the notifications to come from that one place. But history and development has shown us that that it's very easy to break things. As you get into larger applications, there's still there's places where this pattern can kind of hurt you as well. So for example, if I pass around the data, if I pass a reference to the model to some of the views, and then I'm making some changes, instead of having a single source of where changes can be made, one owner of the data, I might have all my views that do that. So there's this possibility of having too many hands in the cookie jar trying to update the data. So the RxJS is really, it's kind of an evolution of this observer pattern. And it still uses this same pattern, but the difference is it's taken some of those learnings that have happened over the years and really tried to address some of those, and it's become more opinionated. So it's much more specific than just that generic gang of four pattern. So in other words, we have our subscriber or observer. Same type of thing. The subscriber observer is who's interested in the data. We have our observable. That's the subject. That's the thing that's being observed. Notice it still has, instead of an attach and a detach, now it's called subscribe and unsubscribe. Same thing. We're passing in. Whoops. We're passing in an observer, so it can subscribe, and then, whoops. And then notice we have this next. That's similar to our notify function right here. Notice that the subject before had the attach, detach, and notify inside of there. That's still going to be true because notice these are interfaces, and the subject interface implements both the observable and the observer or subscriber interface. And so our concrete subject is really that one source of truth that manages all of that data. So our subscriber, notice it's still, the concrete subject then has an array of subscribers that it manages and it maintains. So anytime a new subscription comes in, we dump that subscriber into that subscribers array. And anytime a change happens, what we do is, again, we notify each of the subscribers. We call next. And that next function, notice that's the same as our subscriber or our observer class. It also has this next function. So in other words, when I call next, it's basically saying I've had another event. So this is the next event, and any subscriber that's interested will fire that event. Yeah?
So the difference is that
So yes, it's actually the observer has next, but because our subject also implements the observer interface. I mean, there's many ways to implement this. This is kind of the way RxJS does it. The pattern that has come in, the subject also implements the next function. So it knows to notify. So when it calls next, it will then go and call the next of the individual subjects. That's kind of like our pipe, our data stream in between the subject and the observers, the subscribers that are listening. So the subject calls next, or it notifies them, and it does that by calling the next, whatever your event is for the next function in the subscriber. Okay, so let's take a look at that in action here. In our code, what I'm interested in now, let's take a look at this cart.service add book. If I'm going to come to my cart, I called it the header cart. I kept this really simple. We can get way deeper into this, but just for simplicity's sake, notice all we have is this header cart, and I've got a shopping cart service. So before I go to the shopping cart service, let's take a look at this cart. So I don't think I actually needed this. I was playing around with that, but I'm going to leave it in for now. And the only thing that I really have inside of this that's interesting to me is I have a reference to my shopping cart service that's going to manage where the data lies. So any changes that happen to my shopping cart service, that's my subject. So no matter where I am in my application, if I want to add something to the cart or remove something from the cart or view, I'm going to go to the shopping cart service to get that data. Now in my cart component, the only thing I'm really interested in this one is I just want to get a cart, and notice the cart is an observable of type book. And I get that where I say when I have my constructor, this.cart equals this.cart service.cart. So I'm just pulling the cart. So where is that? What is this cart object in my cart service? My shopping cart service. Again, the only thing I'm really doing inside of here is I'm maintaining a collection of books, and I'm adding to it. So I'm not even giving the functionality to delete or anything else. I'm just adding items to the book, and then so I've got a subject. We'll get into that here in just a second. I've got an observable. So the subject is the thing that's is the data. That's basically my store, if you will. If you've done some Redux or NGRX, our subject is a store that we're looking at. Store. The observable is the thing that I'm watching. So notice that I'm taking this cart subject and I'm just returning it as observable. That's the nice thing about RxJS. Instead of having to build this whole framework, it's already built. All we have to say is call as observable, and this immediately returns an observable object for us. When I add a book, I pass in a book, and notice, and this is kind of the key. Remember when I talked about in the old observable pattern, there's this chance of I'm passing data around, and there's several different places that might be modifying the data. And I don't know where it's being modified. And so that's really difficult to debug if you have 5 different views or things that are modifying your data. One of the key concepts here is this is immutable. This subject, anytime I make changes to it, I'm not changing the data inside that subject. Instead, I'm cloning it, and I'm building a brand new subject, and that's what gets passed around to all observers. So that gives us some data safety. So I'm making sure that I'm always working with new data, and we don't have we're not stepping on each other's toes in the different views. So I clone the cart, and then I'm going to push. I'm even cloning the book, so I'm doing a deep clone that comes from this this Lodash framework that does a deep clone. Otherwise, I would just be cloning an array, and it still has all the reference objects inside of there. So we want to do a deep clone. And then I'm going to just say this.cart.subject.next, and that's my notify. So I'm calling the next, and it pushes to anybody who's interested. Anybody who's subscribed to that will get this event that returns. In this case, it's returning the entire cart. So the clone cart is what's going on down here. The only place where I'm actually adding anything is in this observable demo. In my observable demo, let's look at the HTML. So I've got a previous button and a next button. All that's going to do is manage, which page I'm going. And then I've got this Add to Cart button. And so when I click Add to Cart, I'm passing in the whole book. So the only thing I have to do is, again, this view, I'm not displaying anything from the cart in this view, but I'm interacting with it because I'm able to add items to the cart from here. So I need to have a reference to my shopping cart service. And then I just call this.cartService.add book. And every time I add the book, that's when the observable, when the event will fire. I think I've already got it running. Okay, let's go to observables. So here with my pages, I can see the different books that are in here. Now if I want to add books, you'll see that as I'm adding books, I didn't really put any logic in. I could add the same book 10 times. But you'll see that my cart is updating. So when let's take a look at what's happening inside of here. Let's go to source and just in my observable. All right, so at a breakpoint here. And I can't really, well, let's just take a look at that. So I'll click here. So you'll see that I'm calling this.cart service. I'm going into my shopping cart service, cloning the current cart. Let's just jump out of that. And so there's my cart. It currently has 8 books in it, or 9 books in it. And then I'm adding another item. So now the cart has 10. And then I'm calling cart subject.next. I can't really, because of the way that I wrote this, there's no code on that I can step into on the shopping cart view at the top. Let me show you why. Because I don't have an event that's pulling that back. All I'm doing is I'm just subscribing to that cart service, so it's pulling inside of here, and in my cart up at the top, I'm just taking a look at the cart. Because it's an observable, I have to make it an async call. So I've got my cart, it's async, and I'm just calling .length on it. So there's not really function that I can step into.
What would the alternative syntax be for that? For getting
so
that data into the UI. So instead of async pipe.
Sure. There are a couple of different options that you have here. So number one is, let me get back to my code. I was in my code. That's because I'm not in my dark view. So I could say this.cart. Rather than this.cart here, I would say this.cart.subscribe. And as I subscribe to this, now I've got, of course I'm on front here, so similar to here, where I'll say this.subscribe next response, so I get the response. In this case, the response is an array of books, so I don't have to call it response. Whoops, where was I? We'll just go books. And I could say this dot cart equals books. And now, because of that, books is no longer an observable, so this can't be an observable up here. It would just be a book array equals. So we've got that. I'm not going to add any error handling inside of there. And what I would need to do is in my cart component up here, I just need to get rid of this async. And it'll probably not work because it's a demo. Yeah.
I think that's good.
So let's see if it worked. I got my breakpoint. And it didn't work. So it almost worked, but we can look at the code now. Let's take a look at the code. We'll see. I am fairly certain. No, well, I know it'll jump into the code, but I'm not sure why it's not updating. There's where's my header? Okay, so I'll add a breakpoint. This.cart equals books. All right. So there, I jumped into that. And we can see the books is this array. So there's 7 books inside of the array. What's that?
Can you move your mark for check?
Yeah. Oh, you're probably right. Let's do that. Inside of the observable. Let's try that. One. Oh, yep. There you go. So. And what I'm not going to do right now, but another option that you have is instead of having I'll get started on it, is you could make this header component implement the observable interface. And when I implement the observable interface, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. There's observable. I don't want to suppress. I want to implement. Oh, it's not going to give me that right now. But it would give me, I think there's 4 properties or methods that you would implement, and one of them is the on next. And so that's where I was saying the subscribe is basically the on next. But if I implement the observable here, then I would actually have an on next function. And so instead of coming into this this fat arrow function, I would actually have a fully defined on next function that it would fire.
Could you describe why you're using on push?
Oh, I didn't describe that. I just had this in here, and I was having some issues with this change detection earlier, and that's one of the things that I tried. It might have just been this. It might have just been that error right there, that because of the mark for check. It's on, yeah.
Observables are normally part of the async cycle, so Zone.js picks them up.
Yeah.
So you don't think that you have to use change detection like this if you're not using your own push change detection strategy.
What?
You do need to use mark for check.
Yeah, that was me. I was playing around with that because it wasn't working before either, and when I went with on push,
So if you remove line 21 then with that, does that run correctly?
remove this now.
Yeah, or comment it out. Does that
Let's
with
try it.
12 and 21 turned off? Does that?
Now I'm just going to look like a fool because nothing's going to work anymore. Oh, it works. Oh my gosh. Okay, there you go. One of the things, just last thing that I wanted to note here is this: if you've ever worked with with Windows applications with WPF, they use MVVM inside of there. This is almost, I mean, this is MVVM really. It's almost identical to the way MVVM is implemented in WPF. And so if you've ever worked with that, if you start thinking that direction, that's really where this power comes in. We can have multiple subscribers to the same event or to the same observable, and we can subscribe and unsubscribe, and you can also cancel events. So you just have a lot more flexibility and power than you do with promises. And really, the big thing here is that instead of thinking the way we're traditionally thought about event-driven programming, where when a user clicks, I want to do this. This opens up a whole new world for us because we can listen to all kinds of different events and make our applications much more responsive. Any other questions? Yeah.
What version of RxJS are you using?
Let's take a look. 6.3.3 or above.
You have the English CLI build the projects as well as update them. It'll keep up with the current version of RxJS automatically. So you just want, and I think it was an NG update.
I think it's update. I always do upgrade and it tells me, do you mean update? Every time.
Exactly. Any others? Okay, I know we have another speaker, so I don't want to take any more time. Thank you.